So, hello everyone and welcome back from the coffee break. We are here to discuss election security, something that has been discussed widely, something that has caused lots of controversy, and something that has become perhaps kind of a buzzword by today. And at first, I have to say that unfortunately our original moderator, Dr. Camino Cavano, couldn't make it here today, which is why it's me, Ann Väljadaga, the session manager and legal researcher at NATO CCD COE, who will take the honorable and, might I say, a bit intimidating task to moderate the panel actually here right now. So, first, we have a very distinguished panel here, made up of technical experts, policy and strategy experts, and an active politician, in fact. So we have an exciting mixture of perspectives, and let's hope for a truly enriching discussion. First of all, I would like to introduce our panelists, starting with Dr. Herb Lin on my left hand, who's a senior research scholar at Stanford University's Center for Cyber Policy and Security, and also a Hank J. Holland Fellow of Cybersecurity at Hoover Institution at Stanford also. And besides that, he's the author of multiple publications on security, ranging from cybersecurity to biosciences, and most recently his book called Bytes, Bombs and Spies, the Strategic Dimension of Offensive Cyber Operations. Then we have Dr. Jason Nurse, Associate Professor of Cybersecurity at the University of Kent. Dr. Nurse's main areas of interest include cybersecurity, privacy, and the risks associated with thereof. Among other things, he has looked into how the procedural security safeguards actually play a role in securing internet voting systems. And on the other end of the table, we have Marietje Schaake, who's active politician, served as a member of European Parliament from 2009 until 2019, where she actively pushed for digital freedoms and copyright issues. In addition to that, she has served as the chief observer of the European Union Elections Observation Mission to Kenya. And she also has been a member of the Transatlantic Commission on Election Integrity. So we have really a wide array of perspectives presented here. And perhaps, this is my personal hope for the session, by the end of the session, everybody would have a more clear perspective of what we talk about when we talk about the cybersecurity of elections. Originally, the panel was titled Election Security and Cybersecurity, Different Yet Complementary, and this is maybe the guiding theme for today's discussion. So, I would like to start by asking your personal assessment of the current risks. Are free and fair elections in peril, or on the contrary, are the risks currently associated with cyber and cyber-enabled? Let's make a distinction here. Threats a bit exaggerated. Let's start with Herb.
So the question is, are free elections
in peril because of the cyber and cyber-enabled operations?
Well, in my view, they are yes and no. No, in the sense that they are nobody's holding. There's no physical force involved. We're not at the point where we have to have election monitors, police at voting stations to enforce a person's right to actually cast. In two senses. One is the security of the underlying technological infrastructure for supporting voting, and the other is in the information that voters receive, and If you believe that good information is necessary for votes to be cast properly, then that, yes, that is in peril. So,
Jason, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree in a number of different ways. I think, yes, they're in peril, especially because these days, when it comes to, I would focus more on the voters, let's say the mind of the voters, and also the candidates in general, because while I believe now there's a significant emphasis on kind of beefing up the security of voting systems, voting processes, and things like this, where I think attackers have kind of recognized that, and what they're doing is they're targeting the minds of voters with misinformation and things like this, and then they're also targeting politicians. And we've seen this kind of repeatedly, where there's been much more focus on if you can't get to the electronic systems and you can't get to the minds of voters, or in complement to get to the minds of voters, basically trying to attack candidates, maybe steal emails, maybe get anything that's slightly incriminating and publish that to try to aim to discredit candidates. So I think from my perspective, I can definitely agree and also add to the fact that I think they're in peril simply because of these reasons, and because it's kind of the attack platform that we are faced with these days.
Maritia.
Yeah, so thanks for having me, and thanks for stepping in to moderate. I think we cannot be vigilant enough when it comes to protecting the democratic rights of our citizens. And so I'm going to focus, for the answering of this question, on Europe particularly, but on the role of democracies to enable free and fair elections in the broadest possible sense for the moment. So we can talk globally as well, because obviously this is not just a challenge in Europe or in the US and Europe. But I like to think about the democratic process and elections as an ecosystem. And I think there are a number of very clear weaknesses in that entire ecosystem. One, there have been blatant attacks, attempts at hacking on the level of the technology used for the elections itself. So that's one area where I believe we need more stress testing and where we need higher standards, for example, identifying election technologies as critical infrastructure that would automatically enter into play a number of requirements for higher protection of these systems that would then count as infrastructure. So this is on the level of election committees, the ministries that are organizing the elections, and basically the government side of organizing elections. But then there's a number of other actors that come into the picture when you think about elections. I think political parties, and you mentioned it, are particularly weak potentially. Why? Because in Europe especially, a number of them have to function on the basis of donations from members, contributions, and a little bit of taxpayer money, depending on the proportionate representation they have. But they don't have vast amounts of money. And if the choice is between buying another ad on television in that campaign season or running top-level cybersecurity programs on your infrastructure, well, I know from experience that the choices are easily made to spend every euro on reaching voters and campaigning. So questions about, voter registers or internal primary processes that often happen through e-voting and an online system, or the registration for referenda is another very interesting question. People can bring about a referendum on the basis of signatures. Now, how secure is that process, and how easy or how difficult is it to forge signatures and then to force a referendum with possibly devastating consequences? So in the entire ecosystem of the use of technologies, from the authorities that are responsible to the political parties, indeed the candidates who may not at all be prepared for being hacked or that sort of stuff. And then the question, if a hack is successful and if, for example, sensitive information is compromised, then how do media respond to this? Are they eager to publish a leak because they know it will be a sensation, or are they going to apply the proper scrutiny to assess whether this is indeed information in the public interest or information that is purely intended to manipulate a democratic process? And then lastly, and maybe we'll talk about that a bit more later, there's the whole question of disinformation, and a lot has been said about Russia, and I'm sure in Estonia that's no exception, but I encourage you all to think much more broadly than just focusing on Russia. Russia is definitely not the only actor trying to influence minds in less than transparent ways, but there are certainly a lot of other foreign actors, domestic actors, increasingly involved in this. And I think we focus insufficiently on the role of technology companies themselves. If we're honest, there's a lot we don't know yet. We don't know exactly how algorithms that are ranking and selecting and presenting and promoting information are actually influencing the way in which people's independent decision to make a choice on a well-informed basis is actually manipulated. We don't know enough about how easy or how hard it is to abuse the platforms that also have legitimate purpose, but that due to their opaque business models and due to the fact that it is indeed now a marketplace of ideas where the more money you throw at promoting a message, the more eyeballs you can reach, the more time of people's minds you can attract, is really the dynamic that we need to scrutinize. So just a few pointers to kick off this discussion about why I think that we cannot be vigilant enough when it comes to protecting the democratic rights of our citizens.
Thank you. Anything to add?
From my perspective, the question about these platforms, which I agree with everything you said, is should the platforms be giving people the information they want or the information they need? And those are very different questions to ask. Right now, they're optimized to give people the information they want. And it's not clear that the information that people say they want and the people, what they actually want is what's needed to support real democracy. So I agree with everything you say.
Yeah, and I think we could even get more philosophical. So I think the question is, you know, if you've once searched for antidepressants, or if you've once searched for crime rates by immigrants in your neighborhood, does that indicate that you want a certain political advertisement to pop up in your timeline over and over again? I mean, what is want in this case, and what is a sort of push, obviously paid for by certain actors or in a clever way manipulated? What role does micro-targeting, so using very, very fine-tuned data to then tap into and then use for political ads, but also more broadly advertising, I think is the fundamental question we need to have. And I believe we can only have an informed debate if we know more about the impact of algorithms and business models on the entire information landscape. We can assume a whole bunch of things. There have been a number of assumptions. We have anecdotal evidence because of good journalism, because of, unfortunately, lots of scandals of the behavior of Facebook's, YouTube's, and the like. But I would like to have a much more systematic assessment so that we can have evidence-based and well-informed policies.
I think, sorry, just to add to that really briefly. I think those are really interesting points. And another thing that's really important to highlight is that, and I work in the technology space, and it's funny sometimes people don't even know, they can't explain why a specific ad is given to a specific person, because it's a case of, oh, the machine learning is doing it, oh, the AI thinks this is the best ad to give to a person. Yeah. But unfortunately, in that space where sometimes, right now, there's a big question about the transparency of all these algorithms, these AI, these different processes, and unfortunately, if the case when it comes to machine learning, sometimes people are like, okay, well, the machine says this is the best decision. The machine says this is what ad we should use to target. Therefore, that's kind of it. We kind of believe the machine. And that's really a big challenge we're facing now, where people are trying to fight much more for transparency when it comes to these algorithms, when it comes to AI, when it comes to these various processes. Because for some of these businesses, they just actually don't know the reason why specific things are being targeted to specific people. But it's a bit like, okay, this is what we have determined that they want, so this is therefore, based on the machine, what we will give them.
Well, but the question is, do we think that's acceptable as a society? Because
indeed.
If you're optimizing machine learning processes for profit, then that may be at odds with optimizing them for democracy.
Of course,
there may be a hot topic these days, discrimination creeping in, perhaps unintendedly, but still illegally. And so I think we have to be very vigilant on all those levels. And I agree, it's not necessarily reassuring for me when I talk to security researchers or coders of AI and whatnot, when they say, well, you may want us to tell you what machine learning is going to lead to, but we don't even know. And that's why we like it. And I'm kind of like, yeah, I get it. But, you know, we cannot just have unlimited risk and unlimited unintended consequences just because computer says no.
Indeed.
Yeah.
One phrase caught my ear, and this was that currently people get the information they want and not necessarily the information they need. This brings to mind actually the concept of information security and regulating the information that the people get, whether it's the one that they want or the one that they need. And this makes one question a bit whether the democratic nations are now slipping into the playground of the so-called the other, called information security, and starting to regulate content instead of code, something that has been long been said that this is something that we don't do, we never do that. Is this the way to go? Should we go this way? Please, anybody who has ideas right now. Herb,
when I visit China, they basically say to me now, you see what we mean? This is what you get when you have a free exchange of ideas. You get what the chaos of 2016. Okay? And I have to say, I don't have a good answer for that. I am totally conflicted about that. I am terrified of the consequences of giving up the First Amendment in the United States. I'm also terrified now of the consequences of keeping it. And I'm totally conflicted about it. So
maybe a European perspective, perspective both from the EU and now outside the EU.
Yeah.
I'll try not to be
Still
offended.
in the EU. Let's enjoy the moment. Yeah.
As of right now, I am in the EU.
Yeah, we're both in the EU. All right. Now, I think this is a very important point, and I often, when we have discussions about any form of legislation, I often get accused of you want to regulate the internet, right? But when we make a proposal on anything else, we don't necessarily get accused of regulating society or regulating the economy. Normally it's about preventing fraud or ensuring fair competition or ensuring non-discrimination or protecting the freedom of expression through legislation. So the way I think about it is that if there are laws offline, and this really differs a great deal in different European countries. You know, you have, for example, hate speech laws in a number of countries. In some countries, you cannot deny the Holocaust. Some specific exceptions to far-reaching freedom of expression guarantees. And if we want to make sure that this is also ensured on the internet, then I think regulation may be a solution at times. And while I'm very sensitive to the question of are governments going to tell what people need to hear, I think we should also be equally critical of Mark Zuckerberg determining what people need to hear. So the idea that on the internet, without regulation, freedom of expression is optimal for the freedoms, is a notion that I would like to strongly challenge. I think that information is already highly regulated, but for commercial purposes, and it is definitely norm setting. It is definitely norm setting. If for commercial reasons or just terms of use, it is decided that certain information should be demoted or even not be viewed, then you get effectively, by reaching hundreds of millions, if not billions of people, a norm that this information should or should not be in the public. So I'm a classical liberal. I believe very much in the freedom of expression, but I think sometimes to ensure freedoms, regulations are legitimate.
And I completely agree. And I think that, to be very honest, I'm a strong believer that more needs to be done by the social media companies, simply because we have a really big problem now where stuff is happening online, especially in some of the social media companies' contexts, and let's say everyone knows this is incorrect, everyone knows this shouldn't be happening. A government might go to a social media company and say, can you do something about this? Social media companies say, oh, we're doing all we can, but that's kind of it for now. And we have this really weird off balance, or really, really imbalance, I should say, where social media companies are kind of pushing back to governments and saying, actually, we won't do that, or actually, we can't do that. And it's really, I was speaking earlier about the current situation in the US with I can never remember her name, the Speaker of the House,
Nancy Pelosi.
And that's really a really interesting scenario, because we have a video that's clearly been slowed down to make this person look incoherent. And some people even claim look drunk. And apparently what's happened is that someone has gone to Facebook and said, hey, you need to remove this video because this is clearly been manipulated, it's clearly been changed, it's clearly kind of setting, people are viewing this video as it shouldn't have been viewed. And it's been shared millions of times, and Facebook is saying, actually, no, we won't take that down because of freedom of speech. We're in that space, and it's a very, very dangerous space to be in. So I think that really more needs to be done in this context, especially with problems like this, where that message is being spread. People are kind of taking certain views, but the reality is, let's be frank, most people these days go to social media for news. People don't go to the traditional media anymore, at least in the West. People don't really go to the traditional media anymore. People go to social media. So it's a really big problem we're facing, where if the social media companies are not doing much about this problem, and we have people going to social media for the news, what impact does this have on democracy and a ton of other actual decision-making issues? And I won't even touch on vaccinations.
The issue that you describe is even worse than you proposed, than you depicted it.
That's comforting.
Because it's not just that Facebook didn't want to take that. It put it up and it put warnings all over it, and people still went to it. They still forwarded it. And so.
Well, it is a big story, and so perhaps the fact that there's now vigorous debate about it can lead to better informed policies, because the point is, I understand conceptually that a company, when it gets an ad hoc request to take something down, is skeptical. And I hope that to avoid sort of having to deal with each and every case, including whether far-right nationalists should have accounts and should be able to pontificate about some Nazi-type population theories on these social media platforms, buying ads against them, etc. These discussions are very valid, but I believe it is high time that we have a systemic approach to it that is predictable, that is accountable, that is transparent, because otherwise you are going to keep having ad hoc decisions that need to be made. There can be accusations of bias, which we're hearing more and more from the far right in our country. They're suggesting that the social media platforms are sort of belonging to the leftist church, which is a bad thing from their point of view, and certainly this kind of bias along political lines would complicate this discussion even further. So we need predictable and preferably even legal safeguards that are the same for everybody, whether you're far right, far left, whether you're a company or a person.
Well, I agree. That's a desirable outcome.
Yes.
There's no question about that. My problem is twofold. One is that when you apply something in an even-handed way, as you just described, the people who don't like it are going to complain about bias. Okay, and so and you'll wind up in the same situation here. So I don't know how to deal with that particular problem. So the second thing is that I don't actually think it's possible to come to some sort of objective standard on all this. The more I study this, it's more and more like the definition of pornography, which in the words of a Supreme Court Justice of the United States, I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. That's not very helpful for legislation or any kind of a regulatory framework. But that is the best that, in some sense, the United States, at least the United States, has been able to do. If the EU can do better, we'd love to learn about that.
Well, I can't pretend to speak for the EU, though I would love to. But I think we can find some roots of solutions in notions of impersonating, difference between clear satire and framing someone in a different way, because I've seen manipulated video for satire purposes, which I think none of us would be interested in banning. So the context is important, the impact is important, and I'm convinced that we can find a set of solutions that are even-handed, predictable, and that can also be challenged. I mean, I've had a video of my parliamentary intervention taken down by YouTube. Clearly political speech. I put it on, ironically, Twitter, and within a couple of hours, Google called me because they were not too happy with the advertisement of their unwarranted takedowns. But the point is that not everybody gets a call that easily from a tech company if their content is taken down. And you also need to have avenues to challenge it. You need oversight, and I don't want to see sort of privatized law enforcement of speech either. So I agree it's complicated, but I'm sure that we can get there, and it would be good to think broadly and not ad hoc incident by incident. And I hope that the tech companies, Facebook has already announced such, are going to ask for regulation, because they're going to understand that for them to be the arbiters of truth is also an extremely uncomfortable place to be.
My own view of of Facebook's asking for regulation is that they know that it's a hopeless process and they'll never get any.
I agree with you. Let's prove them wrong. Yes.
And also, it all comes down to the minds of the voters in the end, and maybe we're kind of underestimating them. Or I've heard that it's not about that there are lots of people who are kind of uninformed and prone to manipulation for this reason, but it's that it's so much easier to find the people that are in fact a bit uninformed or a bit more easily influenced by, let's say, content of doubted quality. So what do you think about that? Are there really so many people who are so easily influenced by it, or it's just way easier to find the ones that are?
I think, I mean, if I can jump in and answer first, I think the reality is that in some situations, yes, but I think what we also have is that there's a lot more known about people and what people are interested in, not interested in, based on their online presence. So I do a fair amount of research trying to understand what people post online, how people act online, the information people share online, and the reality is that all of us, all of you, have this underlying online presence that some of you might know something about, some of you might have no clue about, but basically almost all tech companies or companies online, they create a presence is created for you. And that presence basically tries to understand as much about you as possible to be able to try to target you in various ways. Let's be frank about this, right? These days, especially in the West, digital advertising is massive. If you can target people online, and if you can target people online, it means you can personalize messages. This blows television advertising, newspaper advertising out of the water. So the point is, from certain companies' perspective, let's try to find out as much about people as possible. Therefore, we know what they're interested in. We know what their political bias is. We know what what they do at night and no one's watching. They know everything as much as possible so that they can then target you. Now, traditionally, this has been targeting about what clothes to buy, what shows to watch. But now what we have seen, especially with the kind of Cambridge Analytica situation, it's more about trying to influence your views now. Okay, who is actually borderline in their political views based on what they have posted or what they're saying online or the profile we've created for them? Okay, if we know they're borderline, maybe they're the actually ones that can be targeted with certain ads, certain videos, certain messages. And that's the reality. So it's a case of, is part of, yes, certain people can be influenced, but the reality is that there's this online presence, this online profile that we all have that actually lets certain companies, certain organizations know which people actually might be more likely to be influenced than not.
The other thing I'd point out here is that you ask, is that number really so large? When electorates are evenly divided, small differences matter a lot.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I think that was clearly proven that small amounts of people can have a big impact with the whole new outbreak of measles, right? I mean, the vast majority of people are vaccinating their kids. They're convinced that this is the right thing to do. But then only a small number of people might be convinced, including through disinformation that they find online, that they should question the doctors. Yeah. Same way that people can be convinced to question authority, question politicians, question journalists, question everything. Yeah. And this questioning everything and being confused and sort of tuning out, I believe is a much broader goal than simply convincing online readers of one reality or another. So there's a lot of assessment about RT and Sputnik and the kind of different versions of events. And I believe it's not as much an effort to try to convince you of something that can be proven to be false, but rather to get people to check out, to question everything. I hear it around me, people that are well informed generally, that say, these days everything is so negative. When I look online, I really don't know what to believe anymore. I don't watch the news anymore. I'm just going to do other things. And clearly a democracy without participation is in a bad shape. So this broader agenda of eroding trust in liberal democracy itself, creating confusion, is an agenda in and of itself, irrespective of which fact, quote unquote, you believe or don't believe.
I think this measles outbreak situation is really interesting, especially for that, because what we've seen from a kind of an online misinformation, let's say, campaign, is that there's been posts on both sides of the fence. So this was a discussion that was long buried, long time ago. But all of a sudden now you have not only pro messages or kind of against messages, but the opposite side. So now there's kind of this fabricated discussion actually being created, which has forced, just like you said, has forced people into thinking about, oh, actually, is this an issue? I didn't recognize this as an issue. Oh, I probably should check this out more. And that's really interesting because before you would potentially have all messages saying one thing, this kind of coherent message, oh, this person is bad, vote for this other person. Now it's a situation where it's all about confusion. Getting people to think or questions things that they had known for a long time, which maybe now they're not sure about, or maybe they need to go and check. So it's a very, very interesting campaign, especially this measles outbreak.
Oh, that's
this measles
yeah, but
propaganda.
also this whole sort of sensation sells kind of stuff. I mean,
it's the reality. I mean, even
yes.
with newspapers.
Yeah,
right?
and then it bleeds from the online sphere. I mean, if something gets a lot of hits,
yeah.
on Twitter a lot of likes, on Facebook a lot of likes, a lot of searches, first of all, it becomes more popular, but second of all, journalists may think, ooh, there's a story here. Yeah. So there is a real incentive to at least suggest scale. Yeah. And clearly, I mean, I often like to think about it with this metaphor. So let's imagine, we just heard an applause, right, in the other room. Did you hear that? Okay, so let's imagine we hear it again, and we hear, yelling and a lot of enthusiasm, and we know that a politician was giving a speech there. So we're curious, who is this person? What were they talking about? Who is this yep. Arousing person who is so popular and telling an exciting story? And imagine we would open the door, and all we would find is a speaker. Blasting out applause, yells. It would probably give us a different impression of this person than if the room would be filled with excited, engaged individuals. And so the notion of bots influencing this popularity, and then the online sphere leading to stories in what is called the mainstream media, but let's say newspapers, radio, television, and everything. It's also a dynamic that I think we need to look at more, because the incentives to boost the story online so that it may go to the offline media is a dynamic that I think is fascinating. I would love to know more about.
Well, there is a fascinating book written by a media manipulator. I've forgotten his name, but the book's title is unforgettable. It's called "Trust Me, I'm Lying." And it is a book which describes the interesting synergy between the social media and the traditional media, where in which the social media operate in exactly the way you say, and they rely on the traditional media to validate a story, yeah. And then that's what gives it the broad credibility, because when one mainstream media, some vetted organization covers it, then everybody else, then all the others cover it, and that gives it legitimacy. And yeah. now what started out as a social media campaign now becomes, quote, real news, because the mainstream has picked it up.
But what if the popularity online was mostly bot-induced, that it,
But it doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. So it's definitely a recipe for success, but I think it's something that we have to pierce.
Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely right.
Yeah.
And it's often the case that these kind of discussions tend to prefer the aspects of information security because they're louder, they're more colorful, and the show is there. But the aspects of cybersecurity is actually where the silent battle, so-called, goes on. So I'm moving slowly in this direction now. And when I'm thinking about the cybersecurity of elections, then sometimes it's also becoming like a very nebulous term. So where does it end? Does it end in the mailbox of an election official when we include all the auxiliary system? So does it end in the central servers or in the e-voting machine? Where is the limit? Where can we say that it's not anymore cybersecurity of election security, or there is indeed no limit?
My personal opinion is that the reality with cyber, especially as we're living in these days, is that the internet is everywhere. Everyone in here has a mobile phone, for sure. No, some people even have 2 mobile phones, or 3. You never know. And the reality is that the point of cyber is that cyber. And this is actually happening with the Internet of Things. So I was listening to one of the talks yesterday, and the reality with the Internet of Things is that the point is to have a sensor everywhere. to allow people to be tracked, to allow efficiency in terms of buildings, all this kind of stuff, autonomous cars. The point is, especially when it comes to cyber, is that cyber is everywhere. With elections, with cybersecurity of elections, it's the same thing. And it's really important to be as comprehensive as possible. So it is the servers, which these days, actually, the majority of the actual focus, especially from an academic perspective, is how do we secure the servers? How do we ensure they're always available? How do we ensure that when someone wants to vote, that they can vote, right? And that's really the focus. To be frank, that's the focus when it comes to academia, at least from a computerist perspective. But the reality is, as we're seeing now, voters are very important. Okay, the minds of voters, okay, that's also important. We're seeing candidates are very important because, okay, if you can't go after, if you don't have the money or the resources to go after voters, because that's a massive campaign, the focus on candidates, because as you were mentioning before, candidates, have this really difficult challenge. Should I really beef up my security and then have no money to try to actually reach out to prospective voters? Or should I spend my money on voters and try to actually get into power and do something good? So the real challenge and the reality is, from my perspective, cyber doesn't end anywhere. It's kind of everywhere, and especially these days when we have some systems, for example, even Estonia, where you can vote online. That's a really interesting problem, and I did some research on that, and it's a really interesting problem because you can vote of course, vote on your computers. The mobile phone is also a reality. You can send your vote in. You can actually turn it on the day. You can vote by ballot. All this kind of stuff you can do, but the reality is, and the challenge always is, well, what if actually there's a malware on the computer that's being used to vote? What if there's a malware on let's assume that the server is secure. If there's malware on the computer or malware on the phone, all these things are potential challenges. So it's a very difficult thing to draw the line and say, oh, we'll only protect servers, and we'll have some observers in, and then we'll check that everything looks good. And also the reality is, when it comes to some server systems, transparency is a big issue. And the reason why I believe that a lot of countries actually haven't switched to online voting is because they're very, very worried about transparency. Very, very worried about actually being sure the vote that I cast is actually the vote that's recorded and the vote that's counted, right? But the reality is, especially the kind of level of technical systems that we're having today, is very, very difficult to have that transparency. And if it's very difficult to have that transparency, then some people might not actually be keen on voting online. Because it's a very, very difficult thing to prove, it's a very difficult thing to be sure about, but you can be much more sure. I mean, everyone will probably agree current voting systems have their own issues, but people are comfortable with them. Everyone knows, if you want to vote, you get your vote, you go into the box, you drop it, you come out, you drop it in, and then that's it. When it comes to taking out your phone and maybe voting online and pressing a candidate, who knows whether your vote was counted or not? It's a very, very difficult thing, and that's kind of a mind change thing. But that also, in my opinion, is part of cybersecurity of elections. I'm not sure if anyone.
Well, I want to build on something that you said earlier, that you drew the distinction between the machines and the voters, and the minds of the minds of the voters. I thought that distinction was really important because the best measures to protect machine security do nothing to protect the mind of the voter. And so you can think about election security as a cyber component and a mental, psychological, person, informational component. Or you could just call everything cyber. I think calling everything cyber is the wrong way to do it, but because of the distinction that you wanted to make.
What would be the risks associated with this approach that you just mentioned?
With calling everything cyber?
Yeah.
Because then you start thinking that traditional cybersecurity measures help protect the minds of the voter, and they don't.
Yeah. And the real challenge we're facing, I mean, I engage with it. So a lot of my research is actually focused on the human aspects of cybersecurity, right? And it's a really big challenge that I face. Because when you go and speak to someone about security, especially if I tell someone, this has happened so many times, I go to introduce myself to someone and I say, I'm Jason Nurse, I do cybersecurity research. Oh, you're a cryptographer. No. Oh, you do technical security, you code all day long. No. Not quite. I focus on human aspects of security. I care about people's minds and why people fall for phishing attacks. That's security? I kid you not, and that's the reality. Kind of people have this problem when you tell people security, that it's kind of, I'm a techie. I am traditionally trained as a technologist, but I want to get away from purely computers as much as possible, because I really believe that these days, the real challenge isn't kind of securing the technology per se. It's kind of more to help people engage with the technology, and also people themselves. Because attackers are recognizing, cyber criminals are recognizing, actually, the technology is really hard to break these days. Because people have been doing it for so many years. The individuals that use the technology, they're much more easy attack platform. They're much more exposed. They're much more likely to believe when you send them an email saying, if you click this link, I'll give you £1 million. Yeah, sure. What? Okay, what's the risk here? If I click the link, oh, something bad will happen. But it's even interesting, if you ask people, does a firewall protect you from every potential attack? Half the people will say yes. No, it doesn't. But that's the reality, and I'm not kind of making jokes at people, but it's more the reality. There's a massive educational component, there's a massive people and people's mind component, and this is very, really important to election security, because it is where the battle is focusing on now.
Maybe just to add a slightly different point, because I think this is very interesting, but another element that we may want to look at more is the challenge between, especially digitized processes of elections being outsourced to private companies, but the accountability remaining for the public. So let me give you a very concrete example from Kenya, where I indeed was the EU chief observer in 2017, where we could fill a whole day talking about technology, democracy, and what happened there. But I want to zoom in on one specific element, which is there was an election and there was a challenge to the results. Basically, somebody was saying there was a manipulation, hacking of the servers, and there has been an altering of the vote count. And the Supreme Court of Kenya, imagine, asked for an opening, an audit of the servers. But the servers were in the hands of a private company. And the private company was not able to provide this audit in due time. Therefore, the Supreme Court of Kenya concluded that it could not be excluded that there had been manipulation, because the absence of manipulation could not be verified, and recalled the presidential elections. These are massive consequences of accountability towards the public, but proprietary access for a private sector company. And in a strange way, I think for a long time, the lack of trust, because a foundation of trust cannot be, or a lack of foundation of trust cannot be replaced by technology. I think that's clear. I mean, in the Netherlands, we vote on a piece of paper, but at the end of the day, there's not one person sitting in a room with all those pieces of paper. They are aggregated in Excel sheets or whatnot, maybe slightly more sophisticated programs, and so it gets digitized at some point in the process. And actually, recently, during elections, there had been a little batch of votes uncounted. So a few days after the elections, the electoral body reported this, and there was no fuss. No fuss at all. And it's probably because, one, the numbers were too small to alter the results, but two, because there's a general trust in our societies. We trust our election committee, and people didn't go into the streets. They didn't fear that there had been fraud, even in the recent years. If any such thing would happen in a country like Kenya, where the basic trust in authorities, the basic trust between institutions is fundamentally absent, there would immediately be concern. And so, because of a lack of trust, there's been a lot of push to go from paper ballots to digitized systems. That's the irony, I think, of the whole story. And then, no, because traditionally in large parts of the world, voter fraud happened by ballot stuffing. So people associate pieces of paper with manipulation and trucks full of, pre-printed ballots with marks and everything. And now so much is digitized, but it presents a whole bunch of new risks in an environment where sometimes legal protections are entirely absent. So let me conclude with one more example, which is that in the country of Kenya, there are no data protection laws. So while people's registration for the elections and the processing of all this data is happening, their rights are not protected, which also means that as observers, we can't assess whether the practice meets the legal requirements, because there is no legal requirement. And so you get into a whole different landscape when the basic trust is lacking, and when people rely heavily on technology, especially private sector technology, without the foundations or without the possibilities for oversight. And clearly, the public accountability leads for the price being paid of any failure to land on the public side.
Very interesting. Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, it's a case study to be investigated, for sure.
And I've never heard that. I mean, in some regards, I can understand it simply because it really depends on the country. And I think if a certain country, and this might sound bad, but I trust you all. Not sure of the video, but I trust you all. Actually, you know what? I'll stop there. No, I want a job when I go back.
I want to underscore what you said about the importance of trust, and just to point out that it's the undermining of trust that is the objective of the enemies of democracy. That is what they try to do. They try to undermine the institutions that provide continuity and trust. Journalism, universities, government, and so on. And that's really the hard part about this, which is that it takes a long time to build up trust. It's very easy to destroy it.
Yeah.
So.
Yes. Yeah.
It's also been often emphasized that the very grounds of our system that is equally chastised and praised, is trust. Jason, when you did your study into the procedural safety, the security safeguards in Estonian I-voting, then what about the role of trust there? Is it the mainly trust-based system or very interpersonal?
I think it was from what we found in our research, it did seem like a kind of primarily trust-based system. And it was really interesting because when we did the work, we were, Estonia is, a significant country when it comes to online voting. I mean, it's literally incredible. But from what we found, actually, a lot of it is actually based on the fact that the Estonian people actually trust the online voting system. And it goes back to this issue before of trust. I mean, trust is very important, and this trust has been built up over a period of time, and gradually there are actually been increases in the amount of people actually voting online, and it's really, really significant. When we did the work, we found a number of different things, some good, some not so great, but what was really interesting from the Estonian voting system is that some of the components are procedural, and some of them rely on kind of strict procedures and way how things are done. Some of them are much more technical. Since we did that work, it has actually moved forward a bit to be a bit more on the technical side. But from what we saw, trust was extremely important, and trust is one of the big reasons actually making the I-voting system in Estonia what it is. I highly doubt that the system here could just be taken and adapted to another country. Even at the same size, don't think it would work. Oh. Estonia as a country is extremely digital. Literally, it is brilliant. I love technology, and when I come here, it's amazing. But other countries are not like that. So I think and when we did the work, it was very clear. The Estonian case is really, really interesting. It really, really works in terms of the I-voting. Other countries, they wouldn't stand a chance at implementing it. The trust isn't there in technology. Also with Estonia, one thing that was really, really good to see was the fact that because of the size of the country, because of the flexibility, its agility, it can actually properly deal with issues that come up and actually kind of ensure that the population is a certain level of digital literacy, whether that comes to cyber or not. Whereas for some other countries, especially much bigger countries, is a very, very big challenge to actually push forward national security awareness campaigns. Get people to think about links before they click them. Get people to understand what malware is and why they should care. Get people to think about entering credit card details online and checking sites first. These are really big challenges, but these are challenges that kind of Estonia has overcome simply because of how the system is set up, how flexible it is, and how well and how much actually the Estonian people actually have built trust in the system. And it goes back to what Herb was saying. Trust is very hard to build, but when it's there, you kind of really have to you don't have to hit it hard sometimes, but if you hit it in the right place, it will fall on. But with Estonia, I don't think it has happened thus far.
But I fully agree, but I think we need to distinguish between sort of verifiable procedures and general sense of trust in institutions and everything. And when it comes to elections specifically, clearly verification is crucial, whether it's in a backup system for digital vote or paper voting or whatever. And I think we should go on the basis of trust but verify.
Yeah, no, of course. I mean, the reality is, and what was actually very happy to see based on the work that I did a few years back. Since then, they have actually moved much more towards verification and formal verification using much more computational techniques.
You mean here?
Here.
In Estonia, yeah.
Here. Yes, here. Sorry.
Yeah.
But I think you would agree that the technical verification is necessary, but it's not sufficient. In this, it's not. You can't buy alone. It can't do the job.
Yeah.
No, I mean, normally one of the essential ways to verify is that there's multiple media, multiple formats in which votes are transmitted, for example. So there may be a transmission of a scan, there may then also be a keying in of the same results, and then there may also be a paper copy, so that you basically have 3 counts that need to all match up. Yeah, so you definitely need multiple methods also of verification, not just through scanning or
fine, but those are, I included. It's a fair comment. I was making that. My point was that you drew a distinction, which I liked, between the sort of verifiable procedures and technology and so on, and the generalized institutional trust. Yeah. And I agree that they're separate. My point is that one doesn't substitute for the other.
Oh, absolutely. Right. Sorry, then I didn't understand. Right. Yeah, you're absolutely right. No, can't. And technology can never substitute trust either. That's the point. And I think sometimes that is the hope that people have, that especially in developing countries where, you know, the legacy systems were so fraught that they hope that maybe a computer can sort of safeguard them. But even if, you know, all the steps go well, until the very, very end, if anyone is able to manipulate the final counts, then you can still, with the simple manipulation, impact the entire outcome. So there's no magic bullet for sure, and everything needs to be protected and secured over and over again. And for that, you also need well-functioning institutions, checks and balances, oversight, et cetera, et cetera. But what worries me in the digitization process is that a number of these very fundamental procedures for democracy are taken out of the hands, essentially, of those who are accountable for the failures. And I think this is just like a fundamental point that we have to think about also in our Western democracies. I mean, the whole question, what exactly happened in the United States in 2016, I have to say I'm not studying it every day, but I think there's still many more questions than answers. And perhaps that is also because some of the key information is not in the hands of the public authorities that could then submit them to legal procedures.
This leads me to a question that does perhaps today's increasing reliance on technology in elections lead to a tension with constitutional requirements, the traditional requirements to elections, like that they are free, general, uniform, direct, and this principle of secret ballot? Is there in fact a constitutional contradiction there? Or should we be so rigid in interpreting the general traditional requirements to elections to begin with?
There are many of us who believe that technology that in an election context, new technology isn't necessarily better.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's an old saying that, you know, there are 3 roads to ruin. Alcohol is the fastest, sex is the most fun, technology is the most certain. And as a technologist, I really believe that.
This applies to elections, I think.
Yes.
But maybe I could bring this to another element of this question, because not all rights and democratic procedures are in constitutions. Oftentimes you have fundamental principles in a constitution and then an electoral law that goes much more into the details. But, you know, fundamentally we have a challenge with the vast and rapid development of technologies and some of the legal details that should sort of frame these developments not being articulated clearly enough. So we find new cases, like let's go back to the Pelosi video. Yep. We will see much more of this, including deep fakes, where it's much easier to even completely pretend that somebody is saying something that they didn't say, so it doesn't even look weird or somebody doesn't even look drunk. In fact, they look as normal as possible, except that they never said the words that the video suggests. And so this technology is evolving rapidly. How do we deal with it? And I hope that we can go to more, in a way, constitutionally spirited principles that are articulated, and then have regulators more empowered to assess whether different types of technology still respect those principles. Because if we're going to write law for every technology, then we're really going to be outpaced by their developments. Democratic decision-making is so slow compared to the tech.
What about voting technologies? For instance, if you would kindly refresh our memories, does the Netherlands have some experience with actually trying to implement an online voting system?
Yes.
And what was the outcome?
So we're back to paper, so maybe that's says it all. Paper and red pencils, which is sometimes challenge. Somebody once marked it with a different pen, and their vote on a fairly high level was not counted or not valid. But the point is, the laws protect the rights, the democratic rights of people, but they don't always prescribe the media, right? So you can change, you can go change back to paper as we did if you want to, without having to change the constitution or whatever. So yeah, I think the Netherlands is a good example of trying digital and then coming back to analog.
Why choosing so?
Because there were a lot of concerns about electronic voting, and we have quite a few people that are technically skilled and that just pushed back. And we still have ongoing discussions about this also with chip card for public transport and the right to privacy, for example, as well. So there's a lot of pushback against digitizing everything, especially when it comes to voting, and therefore the whole discussions about the number of signatures to be submitted to demand a referendum was so interesting, because the level of protection of those processes is very different from the level of protection of the general election infrastructure. And so the verification methods, or perhaps the possibility to impersonate X amount of signatures, thereby forcing a referendum not on the basis of people but on the basis of fake signatures or whatnot, fake registrations, is something. I mean, I haven't looked at the ins and outs of this, but I think such differences in scrutiny and protection and the potential for fraud, manipulation, hacks, whatever, is extremely important. And there should also not be too much difference between different electoral processes. So if it's much easier to manipulate a referendum than a general election, you can also run into problems.
Yeah. I think from my perspective is especially when it comes down to the use of technology in a variety of these systems, it's a massive issue of exposure. The more technology you use, the more exposed you become. But the key thing is here, not only the more exposed you become, but the more exposed you become to the entire world that might be interested in compromising any part of the process. Technology is great, the internet is great. The fundamental problem of the internet is that it allowed you to be open to access or attack from anyone, anywhere. We live in a society where you can't go after anyone, anywhere. It just doesn't work like that. Even if you know exactly who is the person in the country that launched this attack against the system, the process, whatever it is, you can't go after them. It's not always, let's say, that straightforward. So therefore, if you're opening your society, something as fundamental as voting, as elections, to potentially attacks from the entire world, that's a big challenge for people. There's also a big challenge when it comes to transparency. Using these, well, it's online voting systems, any voting system, one of the key things you have to be able to do is to build people's trust in it. Mm-hmm. To build people's trust, transparency is very important. But sometimes it's really, really difficult. So even with the work with that I did with Estonia, it was really interesting because Estonia has put a significant emphasis in making the voting system as understandable as possible to the layman, right? And that's really, really important. That's a fundamental step. If you don't do that, then the trust in this system that has just been implemented will be like, okay, well, what's the system? How do I know this won't mess up my vote? And they have really, really emphasized every part of the system, you can find out more detail about it. And that's part of building trust. That's part of this idea of transparency. And transparency is very important, and it's one of the constitutional rights when it comes to voting, to democracy. Transparency is very, very important.
And now, before I open the floor for questions and answers, just one last theme perhaps to focus on is election monitoring. And there is just one concluding question about that. How are election monitoring tools and practices considering the cyber and information aspects? And is there, or should and could there be some standard practices or techniques for identifying and verifying irregularities when it comes to elections monitoring? And Maritje first.
I would say this is currently nearly impossible, because election observations are very much according to a methodology, at least when they're according to strong methodologies, on the basis of what you can see with your own eyes. And then you have people all over the country. They stay for a longer period, shorter period, and they look at everything, not just voting day, but also Are people being paid at rallies, or is the police intimidating people? Are people free to campaign? You know, is the effort to register even-handed across the country and everything? But the more of these procedures that happen inside servers and out of view of anyone's naked eye, not just election observers, but just anyone, the more difficult it becomes to observe. And so what I think would be useful is to start thinking about frameworks at the beginning of the process that have requirements for procurement and public oversight, as I spoke about earlier, so that at least the procedures and the role of government are clearly articulated and can then be assessed whether, you know, all the actors took their responsibility, including by writing better calls for tender when they do. Because what often happens is that the call for tender already locks in a government to an enormous extent in terms of what can and cannot be done with the technological procedures in terms of oversight and accountability later. So if you have the terms of reference with loopholes, and trust me that a lot of these big companies involved in these multi-billion-dollar contracts globally, they have teams of lawyers that can really use all the loopholes if there's not a very clear call for tender. So I think there is a lot that can happen to improve what is clearly lacking now, but to suggest that anyone can look under the hood and that, for example, take the American case again. Imagine foreign observers, foreign election observers. So let's say me. Let's say I was an election observer in the United States, and I would call on the authorities, the electoral board, or whatever the proper name is in Iowa, and say, hi, here's my credentials. I would like to look in the servers, please. I mean, everybody would just say, are you kidding? That's like national security, you know, off-limits territory. Nobody can look in the servers, let alone foreign observers. So the whole dynamics there, it changes a great deal from when you can actually sit and see vote by vote, you know, coded results going in, et cetera, et cetera.
In the way this plays out most strongly in the States, at least, is that the people who develop the voting machines and so on assert intellectual property rights to the software.
Oh, that too.
And they say you can't see it because it's proprietary and we'll lose our trade advantage and so on. And that's a condition of the sale. Contracts also sometimes prohibit you from talking disparagingly about the product too, and it's a mess.
It's a very good point.
So,
yeah, it's a very good point. I agree. Yeah.
I mean, I don't have much to say about it. I think what it comes down to is this kind of issue of transparency, as kind of both of you kind of alluded to. Sometimes it's not there, and if it's not there for something as fundamental as a voting process or voting software or understanding what's actually happening, then it's a big problem. And that's why I think a lot of countries have said no to online voting, to certain amounts of digitization of the voting process, simply because it's it becomes much more difficult to do these checks and balances. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden you can't have anyone observing. You have to have a specialist that knows specifically how to inspect this bit of code, even if it's even allowed based on IP arrangements. Right. And this specific person is the only person that can tell you if this system is working as it should or not. Yeah. One person. And what if this one person is somehow amenable to persuasion?
Yeah.
That's the big problem we have when things are much more digitized, when technology becomes a much more fundamental part of election process.
Thank you. And now, any questions from the audience? Well, many. Let's start from here, please.
Hi, I'm Dennis Wooders from Leiden University. I have been really enjoying this panel, so thank you for that. I think one of the interesting things that was said among many was, so there's a difference between protecting sort of the technology of the election process, and on the other hand, is your point, to protecting the mind of the voters. And sort of the first one is at least it has some things we can work with. So there's a long tradition, but also a hack is forbidden by law. Interfering with a system is forbidden by law. So there's a legal component to it where I say, okay, this is illegal. Protecting the minds of the voters, doesn't actually involve any crime. It doesn't actually involve something where you say, okay, this is clearly wrong. Yet we're extremely worried about it, and rightly so, I think. And there's also probably a line that starts, for example, most were very enthusiastic when sort of the really internet-savvy campaign of Obama started. And now we're really worried about where we ended up with Cambridge Analytica. But those are on a spectrum. They're not the same, but they're on the same spectrum. So the question then to the panel is, so if there's no crime, if it's really hard to sort of grasp what it is, then how do we deal with the protection of the mind of the voters? And maybe Marietje gave a first sort of inroad into it to say, okay, election observation also has more intangible things like voter intimidation, those kind of things. So maybe it's that kind of terminology where we need to look for. I don't know, but it's to the panel.
Mm-hmm.
Shall we?
Yeah, so please.
Should we start?
Okay, yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
sorry, I thought we were going to collect a few questions, so I was ready to write it down. Okay, I think it's a very tricky subject area because freedom of expression, again, is a fundamental element of rules-based democracy, and changing a person's mind is actually also the goal of a campaign that's legitimate and that doesn't use any manipulation or malicious kind of methods. So it is very tricky, but I think we need to challenge ourselves in the question, are there no illegal activities taking place? Because one, we have the question of foreign meddling. Then we have the question of botnets. Then we have the question of micro-targeting, where I think it can be argued that the use of certain personal data for advertisement is challengeable, at least in some legal systems. Advertising laws, I believe, should be very vigilantly applied. So what is and is not allowed. Non-discrimination, very important. I think we need algorithmic accountability. I've made that case for years now, but the whole idea that there's one sector so powerful and so unregulated without any oversight in the public interest, whether it's for manipulating the minds in the democratic context or in the anti-vaccination context in whatever, I think it's unacceptable and unsustainable. So I think there's a lot that can be done. Perhaps another element is that we need to think about the function that public broadcasting had in creating a shared space, in ensuring that certain information that was deemed of a general interest could reach certain parts of the population. We don't have the equivalent online. And especially as younger people gather information, as you mentioned, pretty much exclusively online, one, the sense of a shared space gets entirely lost. And two, a sort of public broadcasting function gets entirely lost. So I do think that there are ways in which we can approach the problem without infringing on the fundamental freedoms that set us apart from countries where there's a minister of truth with all the devastating consequences. But you're right, it's very, very tricky.
Yeah, I would completely agree. It's very tricky, and one of the questions that we kind of have to answer is it right to change the message that people want to see? And it's going back to what you were saying before about what individuals want. Some of these platforms are making significant amounts of money based on giving people what they want to see, based on clicks, micro-advertising, and these different things. So one thing that came to my mind, which I'm actually seeing much more in the research space these days, is this idea of counter-influence campaigns. And the idea there is that if there are people presenting messages trying to influence people one way, then potentially as a country, as an organization, as someone that's interested, maybe there is a role to have counter campaigns actually trying to highlight the truth about a particular situation. But then this goes back to the question of who defines the truth. Yeah. This is a slippery slope, right? As you were mentioning as well, this is a very, very slippery slope. One thing that I do think is very, very important is at least for there to be a better, and this goes back to your point as well about monitoring, there needs to be a better focus on proper monitoring of the messages being disseminated via these platforms. If at least we can have a better understanding of what messages are being disseminated, what their aims are, then we're actually in a better space to try to understand maybe what to do about it. But the reality is, it's a very difficult problem, and it's a problem that countries are struggling with right now because there are massive misinformation, disinformation campaigns they're targeting people's minds because they know at this point that might be considered the weakest link, especially when it comes to election voting. So the question is, what do we do about it? And I honestly don't have an answer because it's a very, very difficult question.
I would simply suggest that all of the measures most of the measures that you, Maria, described as the things that we can do are things that intuitively I think have promise and are good things to do, but I think, at least in the U.S. context, with the one that I'm most familiar with, every one of them would be seen as infringing upon free
First
speech,
Amendment, yeah.
about free speech rights. And I'm willing to bend First Amendment, but I'm not willing to break it. And I don't know how far I feel comfortable going. And that's the tension that I feel. I'm very sympathetic to the things that you said. I just don't know how to implement it in any meaningful way.
Thank you. And then first from the first row, then in the third row, and then we go up the back.
Thank you. My name is Lisa Past. I'm with the McCain Institute for International Leadership, and I do cybersecurity of elections. So I partially feel like Elizabeth Warren by saying I have a slide for all of these questions at the lunchtime election talk. But then I also have a few questions that are not on my slide. The first one is that surely with social media conversation, the focus shouldn't be so much on the content, because it's a First Amendment right, or it's your prerogative as a politician to promote the discourse. And surely the focus currently has to be on the public's right to know who's whispering in their ears. Where the misinformation comes in really is the synthetic identities, the creating conversations that don't organically exist in those political spheres. So aren't we getting off track by focusing on the content and this illusion of an objective truth that we could potentially establish in political discourse, which has never happened, because propaganda by definition isn't that? And shouldn't we instead focus on making sure that we understand who's whispering into our ears instead? Because that's where the deception's really happening.
You mean the origin of the content?
Exactly,
Okay.
and the amplifier of the content, which really is where the social media cases we talk about go to. And then just a follow-up, to you, Jason, mostly is, regardless of the use of technology, is there ever, or has there ever, or can there ever be an election system that is not based on trust? On paper, 100% on paper, and the ballot box, you still trust that that box is properly sealed and the counting happens, and as a voter, you will never be able to verify how your vote travels on paper either. So isn't requiring that sort of verifiability unfair to technology? There's always going to be an element of trust, either in election observers or the election management body.
Yeah, Herb, Jason.
Shall I start? Okay, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Apropos of the focusing on the source versus the content, how can I object to more transparency about source? But the psychological reality is that people don't care, and it doesn't matter. So do I approve of greater transparency? Sure. But do I think that it makes any difference? Not much.
So if I can pick up on the second question, kind of focusing on more on technology, and if technology is well, I think the reality is that the challenge of technology, yes, there's trust required to any voting system. Yes, there's trust required to kind of any technology system. I think the real challenge with trust when it comes to technology and the use of more digital systems when it comes to voting is I find people are more likely to trust something, one, that they've had for a long period of time, even if it doesn't work, and two, something that at least they can relate to much more. So everyone can relate to the offline voting process. When it comes to the online voting process, people start to get a little fidgety. Even to be frank, so I love technology, absolutely love technology. Every time I go to enter my credit card details into an online site to buy something, I kind of struggle in my seat a little bit because I think, oh, is this the right site? And I think with technology, people are like that. And when it comes to something as fundamental as voting, you know, really we're talking about democracy here, something that's really, really fundamental to countries. Online voting using much more forms of technology, it's challenging because people start to trust it a little bit less because it's less transparent, and everyone won't get that level of understanding in the technology where they can get it much easier offline. And another reality where kind of the real emphasis is that all of us are accustomed to offline voting. It's a big difference to take something that everyone is accustomed to, and even if it doesn't work, and give them something new that's shiny and maybe promises to be better. Everyone is a little bit everyone struggles a bit to make that transition. And I think we have that bit with technology, whether any form of technology that we have. So
I just wanted to add very brief points. One is there's been a lot of reference to the First Amendment, and you know there's a lot to be jealous about, but it doesn't cover the whole world. So I think we will see regulation that is going to rein in the space for the tech companies that may not be according to the American model. And secondly, when it comes to transparency and everything, there have been attempts now, leading up to the European Parliament elections, for example, to have transparency registers of political ads. And it was very easily proven to be completely dysfunctional. You know, days ahead of the elections, it was possible to buy an ad. You're not supposed to be able to also buy political advertisement from other countries, right? So it should then be notified, and you were not supposed to, according to Facebook's promises, be able to blast into other countries. But it was remarkably easy to do so anyway. So I think the cost of negligence and the cost of failure to comply with agreements should go up. And we need to look at the bigger picture, because looking at campaign advertisement without looking at campaign financing requirements makes no sense. I mean, we still have complete intransparency in terms of who gets money where. And in many countries, including my own, no requirement for disclosure. So it's fine to disclose, you know, a couple of things that happen online, but if you have millions coming in sideways and, you know, in completely intransparent ways, that can have major impact and nobody would ever know. So we need to look at the whole ecosystem. I've also heard people saying, you know, who needs to challenge disinformation when you have Fox News that is just going on and on the television the whole day, and a lot of people look at that the whole time. I mean, you know, it is a mistake, I believe, to think that there is a magic solution only tackling the social media networks, in other words. I mean, I'm very keen to tackle them, don't get me wrong, but I certainly don't pretend that it's the only solution.
And is there still a question? The third row is...
Working? Yeah. I'm Samuel Thomas. I'm working here at the CCDCOE in Tallinn, in the legal branch. Thank you, first of all, that you made us aware that election security has many layers. And casting the ballot, casting your vote is just the last stage of a bigger picture. And I want to focus on propaganda. So one of the first stages on how I implant some ideas in your brain. So my argument, and please, I want that say no or yes in the end, to my argument is that it's not about the content that has to be regulated, but it's how you transmit those contents that has to have a stronger regulation. And I give you two examples. So when you vote for somebody, before radio, before television, before social networks and internet, you went out, you see these posters when all the people showing their agenda, right? So how you check those sources? You go to the neighbor and you say, oh, I mean, this guy, he looks nice. And who are you voting for in the next elections, right? So even this kind of background check of information is not that reliable, because you're going to speak to other people that probably don't have the solution to that. So in our age, the fact that we use technology to share this kind of news, which are probably flawed, we don't know. Is that the problem of scale? So if we're using bots, for example, to retweet stuff or to share news. And to give you an example from the Italian side, I'm from Italy. We had this politician that has a trial ongoing, and he just posted on Twitter, okay, these accusations that are making me are flawed, and I don't give up. That tweet for 24 hours has been retweeted in a number of times with the use of bots. A forensic study showed that. So, I mean, the content is not the problem. I mean, the problem is how you implant that idea in your mind. And you're right, because everybody's using social networks, and social networks are flawed by nature, because there are algorithms that are like checking how many seconds are you watching a particular news, and then they bomb you with news related to that. So my point is not about the content, but it's how you limit the services to do something to, for example, news sharing and stuff, because Twitter is allowing bots, is allowing the use of bots. So yeah, that would be my argument. And please, if you can comment on that, I would be glad.
So my opinion would be that the challenge that we will always face is that when it comes to some of these platforms, Twitter, Facebook, it depends, whichever one you choose, they're businesses, right? Twitter is an interesting case because Twitter has been struggling when it comes to kind of users for quite a period of time, right? Facebook does quite well, Instagram and stuff like that does quite well. Twitter kind of loses users quite often. So Twitter has kind of adopted this policy where they're happy to allow bots, to the best of my understanding anyway. But the reality is, with these platforms, they are there to make money, right? And making money is all about understanding who the users are, what the users want, what the users are interested in, and tailoring to that, going back once again to what do they want. Let's give them what they want, because then they'll come back. Let's monitor exactly which story they focus on, because we'll target them with more of those stories. And I think when it comes to kind of elections and tying into your mention of scale, pace, these are really some of the big challenges we encounter, because messages that are emotive have been proven to be retweeted and shared the most, because, and it goes back to what you were saying before, if there's someone next door, or if I tell all of you that there's a giraffe outside, everyone's going to kind of want to know, okay, let's go and take a picture of that giraffe and let's post it online, because no one will believe there's a giraffe walking around Estonia. And the challenge there is that we all kind of think, and the way whole things are set up, the way whole society is set up, you're popular, you're more popular, you get more shares, you get more likes, based on some flamboyant stuff. And when it comes to elections, when it comes to misinformation, a lot of the messages are targeted like that. And they're targeted like that, and sometimes they're amplified by bots that have been recruited just for that purpose, or sometimes they're pushed by trolls that have been set up just for those purposes. And I completely agree that the message is one thing, and the source is another thing. Both of these things need to be tackled, both of them need to be understood, but we always must remember there's this pull, right? These platforms need to make money. They're businesses, let's be frank, right? So for them, it's this constant challenge of how much should we do to make money but still keep society relatively happy so we can continue to make money. And that's where we are in my response to your question. Not sure if
Any more thoughts? Also a quick reminder that we are
let's do more
about to
questions.
approach the...
Yeah.
Then one more... yeah. See, I will have a question from there. Let's see. It's very central because it's the last one, but we can carry the discussion on to the 8th floor.
Thank you very much for your engaging discussion. Barry Sander, FGV Brazil. I'll keep it brief. As regards content moderation, it seems to me that no matter how carefully you craft a rule, for example, relating to the Nancy Pelosi video, creating exceptions for parody or satire, because rules are applied by humans and also by algorithms that aren't always going to be accurate, there's always going to be error, right? There's always going to be error in how those rules are applied, how they're interpreted. So then the discussion shifts to what happens when your content gets taken down erroneously. And then I just wondered if the panel had any thoughts on, Facebook's been talking about an oversight board. How given the scale of these platforms, does the panel have any sort of thoughts on effective appeals mechanisms and how that might conceivably work in this space?
No.
This was straightforward.
Wish I did. I mean, the scale problem is exactly the right question to be asking. Don't know how to deal with that. You use the word taken down erroneously. Who decides what's an error? And how do you know that it's an error? I mean, my content is my content. By definition, it shouldn't be taken down. Right? That's my view of it. Otherwise, I wouldn't have put it up. And so, I mean, do I trust? Maybe I trust another body to adjudicate that if I also see that body taking down the posts of my opponents. But then that gets to a very tricky calculation.
Well, I think the question is really who's in charge of the procedures. And the fact that Facebook, now, they call it council, I've heard them mentioning Supreme Court as well. I don't think my eyebrows can rise any higher. Supreme Court by Facebook? I mean, that's like all in the wrong direction, right? So you want independent processes, but you also want to perhaps look at the amplification, because maybe the scale problem is a self-made problem. You know, why is that manipulated video of Nancy Pelosi viewed hundreds of millions of times? Is it because it got recommended? Is it because it was the first hit when somebody started looking for Nancy Pelosi video or Nancy Pelosi at all, Speaker Pelosi, whatever? So I think there are certain discretionary decisions that a platform can make, as they already do, but which I think they need to be more transparent about. So, you know, how does ranking work? How do certain messages go up and down and whatnot? So this can be towards regulators, this kind of oversight, or there can be more understandable and accessible terms of use. There can be all kinds of things that are in the realm of what a platform can do. But when it really comes to freedom of expression issues, I would suggest that you don't want procedures of redress all in a company, but that you want more objective, verifiable, let's say neutral verification, like was said, because before you know it, and this is really where I think the incentive for the platforms themselves comes in, everything becomes politicized, as we're seeing now. The far right accusing the social media platforms of being too left-wing, a lot of other parts of society thinking that they've greatly helped the far right boost their messages, which they would have otherwise not been able to spread, or advertising campaigns that they would have otherwise not be able to wage. Organizing capacity for new networks. I mean, you can look at who benefits and probably never agree. But when it comes to freedom of expression and semi-legal decisions, I would say keep it in the public realm. Keep the oversight in the public realm. Anchor it to the law as much as possible, to also make sure that the rule of law online gets strengthened and not outsourced, privatized, obscured, automated, et cetera, et cetera.
If I just really one quick thing to mention. One thing that I've always found with technology, right, is that the more we implement rules to deal with issues, as soon as we become, we say this is the rule, someone knows exactly what the rule is and they try to find ways to circumvent it. This is a problem that we've been facing in security for many years. It's kind of an arm race in cybersecurity where the attacker does something, the defender catches up. The attacker does something, the defender catches up. I unfortunately feel it's going to be a lot of the case with any approach that's put into place, whether it be Facebook or so on. As soon as the technology is known, as soon as the approach is known to, okay, we take down stuff looking like this, someone is going to adapt it in some way and post something, and they're going to trial it out. And the reality is, with these networks, with these platforms, actually with society in general, and a lot of kind of the way things are done, this is the reality. It's an arm race constantly. Pick what area you want to look at. It's constantly an arm race. There will be attackers, there will be defenders, and that's the reality. Election security is no different.
Exactly. I think that this is a very on point. It was very on point, and we should take them to the lunch break, especially to the lunch session now upstairs on the 8th floor. And in case it wouldn't be for the upstairs lunch session, I would make a wrap up now, but because we continue the discussion anyway, then I will have to cut it up a bit abruptly now. But thank you all for listening, and thank you for let's have an applause for the panel.